You've probably heard about the Panama Papers and how the super rich avoided tax, unlike you, who had to pay it. Presidents, prime ministers, kings and queens, and other celebrities all use the system for an unfair advantage. Have you ever wondered how they do it? Well, it all starts with shell companies, and in this video I'm going to talk about how shell companies work and what shell companies are, how to set up your own shell company, and why we even have shell companies at all. So what is a shell company? Well, it's also known as a paper company, and this is a legal entity that has no business operations, tangible assets or employees. So like the name suggests, these are dummy companies that hide the actual company. And as of 2019, the International Monetary Fund estimated that there were $15 trillion locked away in these shell companies that will never ever be documented. So how do shell companies work? Well, let's imagine I've got a company called Nitro Gains Enterprises, and as Nitro Gains Enterprises grows, the risks to the business and myself increase. So I want to safeguard myself from this company and any future problems. And my best bet here is to create a holding company. Now, a holding company is the first in the maze of corporate structures. And instead of me directly owning Nitro Gains Enterprises, Nitro Gains Holdings will own Nitro Gains Enterprises, and in turn, I'll be the owner of Nitro Gains Holdings. Makes sense so far? So if anything happens to the first company, Nitro Gains Enterprises, or it goes bankrupt, it doesn't really matter so much because Nitro Gains Holdings owns the company and I'll pretty much be left untouched. Now, all of this is legal and I could still be traced by following the paper trail, which would be completely fine with me. But let's say I did want to stay anonymous, I'd put the holding company into the ownership of a trust, and this is where the game starts to get interesting. Because the trust is an entity that has the right to hold and give money to its beneficiaries. So the trust would pay out money to its beneficiary, which in this instance would be me. So the trust is technically owned by a trustee, which would be owned by someone else. And this person is legally obliged to pay the beneficiaries. And no fingers will be pointing at me because the trust doesn't actually have to reveal who the beneficiaries are. So the business looks like this. Nitro Gains Enterprises is owned by Nitro Gains Holdings, which is owned by the Nitro Gains Trust, which is owned by a trustee, who then pays me as the beneficiary, who remains anonymous. So why would I go through this trouble? Well, there are both legal and illegal explanations as to why someone would go through all of this trouble. Maybe I want to legally save on taxes or remain anonymous. Many corporations establish shell companies for privacy and to protect their IP. By keeping sensitive business operations in a separate entity, they avoid the risk of lawsuit and financial liabilities and any other difficulties that may arise. It's like creating a protective barrier around the main company, which is just like how a shell protects its pearls. Or maybe because I want to launder money and evade tax, which I wouldn't want to do because it's illegal and I quite like my life and don't want to go to jail. But criminals can and do exploit the lack of transparency around shell companies in order to facilitate money laundering, tax evasion and even fraud. And these hidden activities lurk beneath the surface, so it's pretty much impossible for regulators to prise open these shell companies and draw out their secrets. So where are the best countries for operating shell companies? You probably won't be surprised to see countries like Hong Kong, Panama, the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands all on the list. But actually one of the best places to launder money is right here in London at 29 Harley Street in Marylebone, just a short walk off Oxford Street, where there is another con going on with American sweet shops and not paying any tax and hiding owners and using them for drug rackets and other illegal activities, but that's for another video. And there are thousands of companies registered at 29 Harley Street, which is a prestigious address and half an hour walk from Parliament, where thousands of directors in the UK remain completely anonymous because they're hidden by these shell companies. For example, you could set up a shell company in Hong Kong, which is then owned by a shell company at 29 Harley Street, and nobody would ever be able to find out who you actually are. And because the UK lets this happen, our economy has been boosted by capital that has been stolen and pilfered by kleptocrats, oligarchs and criminals, money that's been invested through these shell companies. And when Russians buy our football teams, we celebrate because their money brings business, and we just don't care, or we don't even ask where it actually comes from. For example, in Eaton Square, one of the poshest streets in Belgravia and just a couple of minutes walk from Buckingham Palace, nobody actually knows who owns half of the street because they're all registered to shell companies in Panama, Hong Kong and other places that have loose financial transparency controls like Delaware in the USA. And it's because of the reason that rich people can take advantage of shell companies and tax havens which are unavailable to most people that society has become more unequal now in the UK, and it's not just in the UK but globally. So much so that 81 people have more than 50% of the world's wealth combined, and the poorest 50% of the world own just 0.75% of the world's wealth. But despite this, the rich pay the least amount of taxes, with just 4 cents in every dollar actually going to tax. So how did all of this happen? Why did shell companies become a thing, and why are the rich getting richer when food banks are on the rise and society's becoming more unequal? And you're probably thinking it started in a faraway land, but actually the story begins here in Britain. After 2 world wars had crushed Britain's influence and racked it with crippling debts, the British chose fixed interest rates and domestic autonomy as part of the Bretton Woods monetary management system created in 1944. This restricted the flow of free capital and meant that wealth could be appropriately taxed, and this meant economies grew and prospered because all of that wealth could actually be accounted for. But British merchant bankers at Midland found a solution to the restriction of this free capital flow in 1955. The bank was struggling to attract deposits, and it started working with the Moscow Narodny Bank, where the Russian state kept all of its dollar-backed assets. Now this part is important because Midland couldn't actually buy Narodny's dollar-backed assets because of the restrictions on capital. However, it could borrow them, which allowed Midland to finance its UK operations and, more importantly, sidestep the UK and the US regulations. And so whilst this wasn't exactly in the spirit of the law, it also wasn't explicitly against the law, and so the Bank of England did absolutely nothing. And a year later, when the Suez Canal crisis threatened to derail pound sterling, British banks did exactly the same as the Midland, and they started buying sterling to prop it up, only they used dollar-backed assets that were borrowed. And they could do this because US dollars weren't subject to the same regulation by the Federal Reserve as dollars in the US, and so dollars outside of the US eventually became known as Euro dollars, and dollars could move freely in this way. Essentially, Euro dollars were dollars outside of the US that weren't subject to any US regulation. And Euro dollars became a huge market and a big success for the UK. However, Euro dollars actually became so big that they threatened to interfere with domestic autonomy. For example, if a country wanted to lower interest rates in order to increase spending and get the country going, banks would sell that country's currency in order to get better returns elsewhere, forcing the governments to get involved and actually prop up their own currency. And it's because of this that in 1971 Richard Nixon decided to unpeg the dollar from gold, which essentially meant that all dollars became Euro dollars. And it's because of this deregulation that the world is as it is today. Billionaires can freely move capital from country to country in order to increase their wealth and avoid taxation. For example, if one country decided to tax the rich heavily, the rich could just get a new passport in another country and move their wealth to that country where the tax rates are more favourable. And this leads to the inevitable fact that people who can't afford to move their wealth from one country to another end up paying higher rates of tax. And so this is why we now have countries competing for wealth and trying to attract that capital and not asking any questions where the money came from and allowing the owners to be completely anonymous. And they buy property, yachts, houses and sports teams with that money, and there are lawyers, accountants, bankers all out there trying to take a cut of it. And there's very little you can do to stop it, which is why billionaires will continue to use these shell companies in order to hide their wealth and avoid paying their fair share of tax. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.